Hello and welcome to our flip lesson 5.02, The United States Fights and Unites. Human Odyssey reading pages 539 to 557 and your student guide pages 344 to 348. Lesson Introduction. The United States Fights and Unites. As nationalists fought to unify Italy and Germany, the United States also struggled for unity. The young nation had grown quickly as it gained territory in the early 1800s. But the issue of slavery threatened to divide the enormous new country. Abolitionists in the North, in the industrial North, insisted that slavery was un-American and wrong. But the cotton and tobacco planters of the South depended on slave labor. Who had the authority to decide whether slavery would continue or be abolished? Could each state decide for itself? Could the federal government tell the states what to do? The country was on the edge of disaster. Learning objectives for this lesson. Please make sure that you do read your pages 539 to 557 in your Human Odyssey book, as they are covered in more detail than we can do during the flip lesson and during our class session. Describe the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and its significance. Describe the economic differences between the North and the South. Explain why the Civil War is considered the first modern war. Identify Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln and what they are known for. Recognize that most countries had abolished slavery by the early 1800s. Summarize the major events of the Civil War. Summarize the results of the American Civil War. And trace on a map the expansion of the United States from 1800 to 1860. This goes along with your student guide. Begin on page 344. This covers question 1 and 2. So make sure you have your student guide opened. This book right here. Right there. Make sure you have that open to page 344. The Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War. In 1803, the United States bought a large chunk of territory from Napoleon. It became known as the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase extended from the Mississippi River in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west. It doubled the size of the United States. The United States fought a war with Mexico and forced Mexico to give up the territory that extended from Texas to California. This covers question 3 and 4, slavery. The United States grew by leaps and bounds, quickly acquiring territory from Great Britain, France, Spain, and Mexico. Unifying the enormous young nation was a tremendous challenge. Slavery threatened to divide the large nation. Britain and many Latin American nations had outlawed slavery in 1810, in the 1810s and 1820s. And again, if you're watching this on your own, remember you can always pause the video to get your notes down, or these slides are also posted in your OMS, right underneath where this flip video lesson is, right underneath the flip video recording in your lesson for today, 5.02. Okay, so please make sure if I'm going too fast in this flip video, don't feel as if you can't get the notes down. You can always pause when you are watching it on your own. Number 5, life in North America. So this is a chart on your in your student guide. So you can go ahead and take a few minutes to fill in this chart. So the left-hand side here is all about life in these different areas, or life as it was, and in the North, and then also life in the South. So type of farming in the North were small farms. In the South were large plantations. The population in the North, many European immigrants, people that came over from Europe. Population in the South, few European immigrants, many black slaves. Cities in the North, many large cities, including New York and Philadelphia. Cities in the South, no very large cities, a few cities, including Charleston and New Orleans. And then the workforce in the North were farmers, factory workers, businessmen, construction workers, many of them who were immigrants, and we saw that during the Industrial Revolution time in our last unit. The workforce in the South, a few businessmen, plantation owners, and many slaves or enslaved people, people who were basically born to slavery or brought over for slavery. Attitude towards slavery in the North, many wanted to abolish slavery, meaning make it go away. In the South, they relied on slavery to plant and pick their crops, so they relied on those enslaved people to work the farms, much as serfdom over in Russia in the medieval times. Okay, so that's life in North America. That's question number 5. Again, you can always pause this video or check out the flip video slides in your OMS if I went too quickly. Question number 6, states' rights. Many Southerners believe that the federal government could not force its laws onto the states. This idea is called states' rights. Questions number 7 and number 8, presidents of the Civil War. So first I'll talk about Abraham Lincoln, then I'll talk about Jefferson Davis, okay? And then at the end, kind of when President Davis withdrew. So the president of the North, the Union as it was called, was Abraham Lincoln. He was born in Kentucky and he taught himself to read and write. He served 4 terms in the state legislature and called slavery a moral, social, and political evil. His greatest loyalty was to his country. He became president of his country. We know now president of the United States. The president of the South, the Confederates, was Jefferson Davis. He also was born in Kentucky. He grew up as a Southern gentleman, which means grew up in a more of a privileged family. He served in the United States Senate. His greatest loyalty was to his state. He became president of his country as well. And so just so you have an understanding, we only think of one president of the United States, but remember at that time, they were separate. The North was a separate part and the South was a separate part. So Abraham Lincoln was president of the North at the same time that Jefferson Davis was president of the South, okay? So when Lincoln was elected president in 1860, many Southern states withdrew from the United States, okay? Meaning withdrew, they decided they were no longer part of the United States. Numbers 9, 10, and 11, the Civil War. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate soldiers fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Both the North and the South believed the war would be short. They had no idea it was going to last so long. Northerners were confident they could quickly win the war because they had more people, more money, and more factories. Southerners thought they could win because they would be fighting on their own territory and because they had many brilliant generals like Robert E. Lee. The Confederate won their first major victory at the Battle of Manassas. The Confederate Army was so successful during the first 2 years of the Civil War because Lincoln could not find an effective general to lead the Union Army. General Robert E. Lee and his Confederate officers were very capable leaders. Question number 12, Great Britain's role in the Civil War. Great Britain inclined to help the South, even though Britain had abolished slavery because the South supplied Great Britain with cotton for its textile mills. Question number 13, Emancipation Proclamation. For Lincoln and the North, the war began as a fight to preserve the Union, but later became a war to end slavery with a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward, shall be free. Questions 14, 15, and 16. General Robert E. Lee invades the North, which leads to the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln had imposed a blockade on the southern ports, meaning a closure. The South could no longer export its cotton or receive supplies from abroad. Lee realized that a long war would destroy the South if it could not replenish its supplies or get money by selling its crops. Lee took the daring step of invading the North because he hoped he could force Lincoln to end the war sooner. The battle that turned the tide of the war in favor of the North was Gettysburg. Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address to honor the soldiers who had died during the Battle of Gettysburg. In his brief speech, Lincoln presented a powerful vision for the United States as a nation bound together by the idea that all men are created equal. He went on to say that the United States should have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Number 17, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was an effective leader because he believed in striking his enemy hard and moving on. He ordered General Sherman to burn Atlanta and destroy everything in his path as he marched through Georgia and the Carolinas. Grant and his troops captured Petersburg and Richmond, and then trapped Lee near Appomattox, Virginia, and forced him to surrender. Numbers 18, 19, 20, and 21. Factories, weapons, military tactics, and media. Factories and weapons played a big part in the Civil War. Factories supplied uniforms, shoes, bullets, and weapons. The new weapons could be loaded and fired more quickly. The cannons could shoot farther than ever before. The new weapons were deadlier and inflicted much greater damage. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. At Cold Harbor, Virginia, 8,500 soldiers were killed in 8 bloody minutes. The American Civil War also had a large impact on the history of Germany. Otto von Bismarck studied the tactics used in the American Civil War and used them to beat Austria and France. By building railroads and using them to move his troops quickly, Bismarck was able to defeat his foreign enemies and unify Germany. News spread from the battlefield to the public because reporters were able to quickly send news to their newspapers via the telegraph. And for the first time ever, photographers were able to take pictures of the camps and the battlefields. Number 22. Shortly after the Civil War, 2 new amendments were added to the Constitution. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment was added. It declared that slavery was illegal and all men were born with basic rights, including the right to life and liberty. 5 years later, the 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. Number 23, slavery in America and the world. Most European nations had outlawed slavery by 1860. Russia had freed the serfs in 1861, but it took years for the serfs to really achieve true freedom. Most countries in South America had made slavery illegal before 1860, but in Brazil it was legal until the 1880s. In the Middle East world, slavery continued through the 19th century. In China, it became illegal in 1906. Slavery still exists in many parts of the world today. Numbers 24 and 25, changes in the role of women and life in the South. During the Civil War, the women had been actively engaged in the war effort as nurses and hospital volunteers. They had gathered supplies and sewed uniforms. Some had become government clerks or spies. Many Northern women had become active in the abolitionist movement. As a result of their contributions, many people believed that women had earned a greater political voice, and many women began thinking about greater liberty and rights for women. Because of the Civil War, the Southern way of life had been destroyed. Plantations had been ruined. Landowners had to figure out new ways to farm or rebuild. 4 million slaves had been freed and had to face the challenge of building a new way of life. The 11 rebellious states were readmitted to the Union. And again, when we say the word slaves, as history is evolving, we think of slaves as also enslaved people who were enslaved. Okay, so just kind of quickly to make that note. Those two words are interchangeable, moving towards the word enslaved. Numbers 26, 27, 28, and 31. You'll notice that skips 29. We'll talk about that here in a second. Transatlantic Railroad. On May 10th, 1869, this is, I'm sorry, I see it noted there. I have that it does include 29 and 30 on the next slide. On May 10th, 1869, in Promontory Point, Utah, a rowdy crowd joyously celebrated the completion of the greatest enterprise ever yet undertaken. The construction of the Transatlantic Railroad changed the nation. Trains provided a quick, cheap, and easy way of moving goods across the country. The Transcontinental Railroad linked the entire nation and helped unify it. Construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was shared by 2 companies working together at the same time. The Union Pacific Company laid the track west from the Missouri River. The Central Pacific Company started in California and worked east. The 2 companies met at Promontory Point in Utah. Irish, Chinese, Swedish, and German immigrants and slaves did most of the labor. During construction, the companies had to overcome major physical barriers, such as the Sierra Nevada and Rocky Mountains. They had trouble getting all of the supplies they needed to build the tracks, and housing and feeding the workers. They had to fight off attacks from Native Americans. After gold was discovered in California in 1849, politicians were eager to build a transcontinental railroad and began to argue about the route. People wanted the railroad to pass through their region of the country because railroads could move goods and people much more quickly and easily. As communication and transportation improved, the economy also improved. And I know there's a lot of information there. So I do encourage you to stop this video when you're watching on your own, or go back to your OMS slides and make sure you have all of that in there. And this covers numbers 29 and 30. Many scholars consider the Civil War as the first modern war, as it transformed the nation. The factories and inventions of the Industrial Revolution played a significant role in the Civil War. Factories mass-produced uniforms, supplies, and new lethal weapons that could be loaded and fired quickly. Iron masters then turned to producing ironclad warships, mines, and a submarine. Communication and transportation improved. Trains moved the troops and their supplies quickly from battlefield to battlefield. The Civil War led to the concept of total war, in which whole societies were pitted against each other, and there was incredible destruction. The new modern warfare led to a staggering death toll. News of the war and troop movements also traveled swiftly on recently invented telegraph lines. For the first time in history, photography made the public aware of the horrors of war. The South had been devastated and plantations had been destroyed. But the nation had also been strangely renewed by the Civil War. The war established that the United States would be one unified nation and that slavery would be illegal. The nation committed itself to the idea that all men had the right to life and liberty. During the war, factories had geared up to produce war materials. Now, the factories turned to producing things to rebuild the nation. Many women had joined the workforce during the war, and after the war, they began to demand a political vote. Leaders understood the economic and political importance of unifying the nation, and they built the Transcontinental Railroad to link the vast country. And we come to the end. As we think about our country uniting and fighting, I just ask that you think about our Pledge of Allegiance and what those words mean. Have a great day, and thank you for joining me.